So the relativist will cite differences in moral absolutes or moral values as evidence that they are not absolute. This is called descriptive relativism. But C.S. Lewis answers this in Mere Christianity, where he says, think of a country where people were admired for running away in battle, or where a man felt proud of double crossing all the people who had been kindest to him. You might just as well try to imagine a country where two and two made five. So he's saying that despite outward appearances, our moral values are basically the same, no matter who you are. These include things like respecting your neighbor, protecting those closest to you, like your spouse or family, and not punishing people without cause. So one might object, saying, but what about those who disobey those moral values? What about the psychopaths, the dictators, the criminals, those who are so outwardly evil that there's no way they have the same moral code as we do? And on the surface, it would appear that these people have a different set of moral values. But a deeper look will reveal that they have the same moral absolutes as us, only that they grant themselves an exception from following them. So let's take an example from marriage, where the person says, I know I snapped at you when I came home, but I had a long day that was very stressful. It would appear on the surface that the person who does the snapping has a different set of moral values. I mean, they think it's okay to snap, right? But let's look a little bit more deeply at it. We see that this person thinks it is wrong to treat others rudely. That's why they came up with an excuse to grant themselves an exception from following this moral value. In this case, it's that they had a long day that was very stressful. So, despite outward appearances, our moral values are the same, which is evidence that they are absolute. What about the Roman Catholic Church? It says, in the Dark Ages, the clergy of the Roman Catholic Church often suppressed those who spoke out against them. They thought that God spoke through the church, and therefore that these people were speaking against God. Well, the moral absolute here is that it is wrong to speak against God. And we see that on the surface, it would appear that these clergy had a differing set of moral values based on the things they did. But if we look more deeply, we see that they believe it is wrong to speak against God, just like we do, and that they had simply twisted that moral value to make themselves as the mouthpieces of God. So that's their excuse for why they can behave the way they did. Or in the French Revolution, in the Reign of Terror, 1793 through 1794, many noblemen were murdered by the French revolutionists simply for being rich. This was done reportedly to establish a new, better country. And on the surface, it would appear that the revolutionists have a different moral code than we are. I mean, they're basically a bloodthirsty mob running around killing rich people. But if we look more deeply, we see that they believe it is wrong to kill someone without cause. They simply invented a way to make it to where that moral value um, it does not apply to them, or more accurately, that they give themselves a reason, a cause to kill the people they did. In this case, it's that the people were rich and evil and oppressive of the poor people. And besides, it's all for the greater good, right? We have a new, better country in the works. So kill away. But the absolute moral value is the same. So in terrorism, Islamic terrorists often think that killing infidels is a way to glorify Allah, and that to die in a suicide act is a shortcut to heaven. So on the surface, it would appear that these terrorists have differing moral values than us. But let's look more deeply. They believe that one needs to be guilty before they are executed. And the difference between us and the terrorists is that they think that anyone who's not a Muslim is guilty. But our definition isn't that liberal. So the absolute moral value remains the same. How it is applied, or rather twisted, to one's own desires is different. How about human sacrifice? The ancient Mayans and Aztecs thought sacrificing other humans was a way to glorify their gods. They would never sacrifice one of their own. Well, here, the moral absolute, there's actually several. Firstly, one should glorify quote unquote God. So both us and the Mayans and the Aztecs believe that God exists, and it, obviously how we go about glorifying God is very different, but the absolute moral of glorifying God remains the same. And the other one is that you should love your neighbor, and this is seen by the fact that they would never sacrifice one of their own, but instead use captives from war. In the 19th century United States, blacks were thought to be a race whose purpose it was to serve the whites. This race was thought to be subhuman, or only partially human. So on the surface, it would appear that the slave traders had different moral values, but they too believe that it is wrong to enslave another human being. That's why they dehumanized the blacks first, making it quote unquote right to enslave them, as one would own a piece of cattle. But the absolute moral value remains the same. They were merely twisting those moral values so that it yielded heinous consequences. So in Nazi Germany in 1935, the Nuremberg race laws were passed in Germany, effectively dehumanizing the Jews. About 5 years later, they were rounded up, thrown into concentration camps, and murdered. So we ask, what moral absolute could we possibly have in common with the Nazis? Well, the Nazis believed it was wrong to murder another human being. That's why they passed the Nuremberg race laws that dehumanize the Jews. That way, when you round them up and kill them, it's not like killing another human being. You've already dehumanized them. So it would be no different to them as from killing a cattle in a slaughterhouse. Obviously, that's wrong, but the reason that they justify their course of action first shows that they believe they in the same moral absolutes that we do. If morality was truly relative and up to each person, then there would be no need to justify one's course of action. They could just kill whoever they want and not have to provide a reason because there is literally no right or wrong. So in the Roman Empire, many of the Roman emperors claimed to be deity, thus giving them what they thought was the right to rule oppressively. The absolute moral value, only God can rightfully rule over humans. And they imply that they believe this when they first claim to be deity, thus giving them the right to rule other people. What you don't see is some Roman emperor getting up there and being like, yeah, I'm a human just like you, and I'm just gonna rule over you. In spite of the fact that you're a fellow human being, that we're basically equal. No, you make yourself God first to give you that right. Obviously, there's some evil motivations in this, but they show that they have the same moral absolutes that we do. So the logic is that if even those who would appear to not have moral absolutes actually appeal to them, then how much more would that be the case for us? If slave traders, Nazis, Roman emperors, and the ancient Mayans and Aztecs actually have the same basic moral absolutes as we do, then how much more so would that be the case for law abiding citizens? So, this is an argument from the lesser to the greater. These absolutes include things like respect your neighbor, protect those who are closest to you, and don't punish without cause. So, the Bible speaks of a universal moral law, just like we saw. It speaks of one, our conscience, and two, our desire to suppress it. Romans 2:14 through 15 says, for when Gentiles who are non-Jews, who do not have the law, by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. So here Paul is saying Gentiles who are not Jews, they don't have the Mosaic law that the Jews were given. And this law is summarized by love God with everything you have and love others as yourself. So it's the same kind of moral values we have. But in spite of that, they still know what the law is because it's written on their hearts and on their conscience. So the Bible speaks of a universal moral law. Proverbs 14:33, King Solomon of Israel says, "Wisdom rests in the heart of a man of understanding, but it makes itself known even in the midst of fools." So part of wisdom would be treating others with respect. And it says that this wisdom makes itself known even in the midst of fools. So even fools know what moral values are, or what our moral absolutes are, and how they should behave. So we have a universal moral law, and yet we desire to suppress it, just like the people in the examples did. Romans 1:18 through 19 says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them." And we saw that plainly in the examples given. These people were obviously unrighteous, and they used that unrighteousness to suppress the truth about the moral absolutes. They essentially twisted the moral absolute to where it either didn't apply to them or to where it it was okay for them to twist it to their own purposes. So we see this act of us being unrighteously suppressing the truth, despite that truth being written on our consciences. So we could say that the Bible, written thousands of years ago, speaks to today's issues. It speaks to human nature, which does not change. That is why it is so relevant, despite being an ancient document. And the way in which it speaks of mankind, it indicts mankind, should suggest that it was not written by man. So we find moral absolutes in places we would not expect. This includes in the lives of those who on the surface would appear to have a different set of moral values. We also see it in the very arguments used to support moral relativism. For example, one might say, whether I choose to steal or not to steal depends on what benefits society the most. In most cases, it doesn't benefit society to behave that way, which is why I don't do it. Now, on the surface, this appears to support relativism. We are taking a moral value thought to be absolute by most, not stealing, and saying that it actually depends on the situation. But a deeper look reveals that the relativist presupposes a different moral absolute to justify this. In this case, the moral absolute is do what is best for society. That is deemed to be absolutely good. And how we apply that moral absolute sometimes looks like stealing, and sometimes it looks like not stealing. So the difference between what most people would say and this argument is not the fact that they are making moral absolute truth claims, but rather what those absolute truth claims are. Or let's look at this example. I rape, pillage, and steal as much as I want to. I just don't want to do these things, which is why I don't do them. Well, here the moral absolute is do what you want. The person is implying that a person should do whatever they want to do. And in their case, it looks like not raping, pillaging, and stealing. But of course, they imply that if a person wanted to do those things, they would, and there would be no reason to tell them they're wrong. Or how about this? Actions such as treating others with respect, being inclusive, and accepting those who are different from you makes more people happy. That is seen naturally. We do not need to get those values from God. So they imply that the moral absolute is do what makes people happy. And sometimes that looks like treating others with respect, being inclusive and accepting those who are different. But of course, they imply that if what makes people happy changed, then we would be morally obligated to do that too. How about this? Our species has the greatest chance of survival if we love others unconditionally and treat others with respect. You cannot say our moral values come from God when they are explained by this. In this case, the moral absolute is do what preserves this species. They imply this, and of course, it's also implied that if what preserves this species looked like the exact opposite of what we consider to be civil behavior, that we would be morally obligated to do that too. But one might say, well, these are scientific statements. They are not moral statements. So, what preserves this species, or what makes people happy, or doing what we want, or what is best for society is derived from science, not morality. Therefore, I am not making any moral truth claim. And this has a couple problems. Firstly, science cannot produce any conclusion that is absolute in nature. There is always doubt in scientific conclusions, so it cannot be used to prove absolute statements like the ones the objector makes. Secondly, science cannot explain why we want things. It can show that we want things, but not why. So the objector's statement that they want the species to survive or want to preserve themselves is not scientific in nature, which makes it more likely that it is a statement of morality. And if you look at the objector's motivations for saying these things, they are almost always moral in nature. Or how about this example? Lying is wrong in most situations, but there are some exceptions. For example, if you were hiding some Jews in your basement in Nazi Germany, and the SS came up asking if you're hiding Jews, what do you tell them? Assuming that amnesty is granted to those who turn them in. Well, the moral absolute is love your neighbor as yourself. Whether the person chooses to give up the Jews in their basement or not give them up by lying, it is assumes that the course of action that one would take would be the one that maximizes the well-being of the Jews, or of other people, I should say. And that the moral absolute implied in this is love your neighbor as yourself, which is just what the Bible says. So some cultures say cannibalism is morally right, and some say it is morally wrong. Therefore, morality is relative and depends on each culture. So here's the descriptive relativism. The absolute moral value, follow your conscience. It is implied that each culture should do what seems to be morally right to them. So follow your conscience. So my point is that if moral absolutes exist in one, the lives of those we would not expect to have them, and two, the very arguments of moral relativists, then they most certainly exist for everyone else. This is an argument from the lesser to the greater. If moral absolutes exist in as unlikely scenarios as these are, then how much more so would that be the case for normal scenarios? Know that there are some weaknesses of the evidential approach. The evidential approach does have some weaknesses, which is why we are utilizing two approaches in this argument. That is, the evidential approach can only show that morality is objective. That is, it can only show that the moral values that we have currently are the same for all people. But it cannot show that that will always be the case, which is what needs to be said for morality to be absolute. For example, I can show that everyone in our current age believes that one should treat their neighbor with respect, but I cannot show, evidentially speaking, that that will always be the case. I cannot rule out the possibility that someone with truly different moral values might exist in the future, or that they could exist. So we utilize another approach, one that is, in my opinion, more powerful. This is the presuppositional approach. In it, we ask the question, what do the objector's actions say? Because a person can say anything, talk is cheap, but do their actions reflect this? If we take actions into account, we see that no one is truly a moral relativist, despite what they say, for actions reveal the heart. One might say, well, the presuppositional approach is just a way to avoid giving objective evidence for absolute morality. This is not the case. I am only trying to avoid giving evidence when it is unnecessary to give it. That is, if the moral relativist already agrees that morality is absolute, and we know that by looking at their actions, then what is the point in providing evidence for absolute morality? That would be a waste of time, for the objector already agrees with you. This logic is supported by the Bible, most likely you, and most importantly, by the relativist. Let's start with the Bible. Luke 6:43 through 45 says, "For no good tree bears bad fruit, nor again does a bad tree bear good fruit, for each tree is known by its fruit. John 13:35 says, "By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." So, who a person is on the inside is revealed by their actions on the outside. So, the Bible supports this logic, so does the relativist. That is, relativists are often eager to use this logic against Christians. For example, you may have heard a relativist talking about how evil the people were who organized the Crusades, or how evil the priests are for abusing the children, or how hypocritical so many Christians are because they do not practice what they preach. So they imply that if one has to choose between actions and words, if they conflict, then the actions speak more loudly, and we should go with those. So the logic of the presuppositional approach is supported by all parties involved. Therefore, it is possible to think one believes something when one does not. This is often the case with moral relativists. They legitimately think that morality is relative, but their actions reveal what they truly believe. This is a scary situation, for Proverbs 16:2 says, "All the ways of a man are pure in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the spirit." So when it comes to what a person truly believes, a person can deceive themselves and they can deceive others, but they can never deceive God who weighs the spirit. It is therefore incumbent upon apologists to point this out in a compassionate manner, for it could just as easily be us in their situation. So my point in using the presuppositional approach is that even if evidence were to come out that irrefutably contradicts the existence of moral absolutes, even if there were 7 billion people in the world and each one of them had their own set of moral standards, for the relativists to agree with this but to live like morality is absolute is dishonest. Fundamentally, it makes them no different from the priests, crusaders, and modern Christians who do not practice what they preach. One's true beliefs are shown by their actions. So in Romans 14, Paul talks about the one whose actions contradict what they say they believe. He says that there is nothing wrong with eating food offered to idols. However, for a person to think it is wrong and still do it means it is wrong for them. For if it was actually wrong, they would have done it anyways. So what matters is the heart. If one believes something, then they should live like it, even if what they believe is false. Similarly, the relativist claims to believe that morality is relative. If that is what they truly believe, then they should live like it, even if that truth claim is false. To do any differently is to violate one's conscience. And if one cannot live in a consistent manner with their beliefs, then they should reconsider their beliefs. So let's look at the consequences of relativism and see if the objector's actions are consistent with that. If moral truth is relative, then there is no absolute right and wrong. Then theoretically anything is permissible, and there would be no objective reason for stating otherwise. This means that things like genocide, slavery, rape, racism, stealing, lying, false testimony, and murder are theoretically possible. And if a person committed them, then there would be no reason to tell them that they're wrong, because they aren't wrong. And we ask the question, does the objector live this way? Do they live like it is possible to commit genocide or rape or racism and not be morally wrong for doing so? And the answer is always no. Sure, some relativists throw around the idea that these things could be okay in some situations, but that is not what they believe. If one commits genocide like the Nazis did in World War II, or if atrocities are committed in the name of war, such as the rape of Nanking in China, or if someone is exclusive, bigoted, and intolerant, the relativist believes that these things are morally wrong. If they say such things depend on a situation, then they almost always presuppose an absolute moral value from which to do so, which only begs the question. So very often, the relativist says they believe one thing, but their actions state that they believe something different. So this is bound to trigger some objections. One might say, well, relativists are nice people. They would never commit genocide or rape or murder. But that is not my point. My point is not that relativists are horrible people, but that relativism provides no basis for not being horrible. That is, if morality is truly up to you and me, then anything is permissible. There is no way around this. One might say, well, my moral values are absolute in scope, but not in time. In other words, moral values like be nice to others apply to everyone currently, but that might not always be the case. And again, this is irrelevant. Either a moral value is absolute, meaning it stays the same all the time, or it is relative, meaning it depends. So there are only two options. A moral value that depends, even if that is in the distant future, is still relative. There is no reason why I couldn't shift the timeline a bit and say, no, our morality changes now, if indeed it is relative. If the relativist insists that their morals won't change in the near future, then one must ask, why is this? And the reason is almost always something like, we need to do what is best to preserve society. And right now that looks like being nice to others. But this is not relativism. This is presupposing that doing what preserves society is absolutely morally good, in that what our current moral behaviors are depends on that. And this can lead to some devastating consequences. For example, imagine that there was a plague so deadly that it threatened to wipe out the entire human race. And the only way to save humanity is to completely wipe out those who are at the plague's epicenter. So, if what is morally right entails preserving the species, then one would be morally obligated to commit genocide. Or imagine if you and a person of the opposite sex were the only two humans remaining on Earth. If what is morally right depends on what preserves a species, then you would be morally obligated to procreate with this person, whether or not consent is given. So we have just justified rape. Or imagine if Germany had won World War II, gained world dominance, and wiped out everyone who disagreed with them. If morality is up to each society to determine what benefits them the most, then the Nazis would be morally right for justifying their behavior. So we have just justified murder. If the relativist objects to any of these situations, then they show by their actions that they are not a relativist, which would make providing evidence for absolute morality irrelevant. They already agree with you. One might say, well, these situations are only theoretical. They are not likely to happen, so they can be ignored. So you are guilty of what is called a slippery slope fallacy, which is where one paints the consequences of said action to be much worse than they actually are. But again, this is irrelevant. The fact that the system of morality could even theoretically allow for these things makes it unfit to be used. Imagine if the laws of our country said that murder is wrong, but it made some exceptions to that. Or let's say it said, yeah, rape is wrong, unless, of course, it benefits the greater good. Would this law be accepted, even though these exceptions are only theoretical? No, this law would be thrown out, for it is subjective and is unfit to use. And the same is true of relativism, if indeed these situations are only theoretical. And as always, ask on what basis? On what basis does a relativist know that these situations are unlikely to happen right now? And the answer is almost always, well, it's what best preserves this species or myself or society. And that presupposes moral absolutes, just like the Bible does. But these situations are not merely theoretical. Moral relativism both can and has been used to justify heinous things, and one only needs to take a brief glimpse at history to see this. For example, the Nazis set up the good of the Aryan race as the ultimate good worth striving for. And the logical outcome of this is precisely what we observed in World War II. Kill anyone who isn't Aryan so as to keep them from contributing their inferior genes to the gene pool. And the same logic was used to justify the killing of the mentally retarded. Or look at ancient Rome or ancient Israel. They set up the desires of their own hearts as the ultimate good, the moral absolute, and this led to debased behavior that ultimately resulted in their demise. Or look at the evil things the Christian church has been historically capable of. The point should be clear that when one sets up the benefit of self or society or species as the ultimate good, bad things both can and do happen. So the fact that these situations are theoretical should be enough to debunk relativism, but as we see, they are far more than theoretical. To summarize, I will paraphrase C.S. Lewis when he says, everyone is a relativist until someone takes their seat on the bus. A person can say one thing, but if their actions say differently, then we know what they truly believe. So we know this by looking at the consequences of relativism. We can also see it through the moral truth claims that relativists often make. They do not have to make these, as there is nothing inherently moral about saying there are no moral absolutes. However, they make them anyways, as these truth claims are often the motivation behind relativism. The first moral truth claim is that it is arrogant to make an absolute moral truth claim. That is, if so many people have thought that they have had the moral truth and been wrong, then who are we to think any differently? What makes us think we have the right answer? Just look at all the world religions that contradict. Logically, most of them must be wrong. So what makes us think we have the truth? But that is a moral truth claim in and of itself. Truth claim number 2 is that we should be inclusive to all ideas. That is, if all our ideas are only relative to each other, then they are fundamentally equal, and there is no reason not to be inclusive. In this particular country, relativism runs into a problem because the very idea of inclusiveness is Judeo-Christian in nature. That is, the founders of this country were influenced by their Christian faith to allow for things like freedom of religion, speech, or press. So, relativists tend to think that Christianity is the enemy of inclusiveness, when in reality, it was because of Christianity that we have the rights we do. So, to attack it is to undermine the inclusivism that they love so much. Third on the list is that we should treat all ideas equally. That is, if there is no absolute right and wrong, then who am I to say that my idea is better than yours? So all ideas are equal. Fourth on the list is any objection to organized religion. Organized religion is usually first on the list of culprits. They are the ones most notorious for making absolute moral truth claims. So the relativists must object to these. The fifth truth claim is that we are morally obligated to obey the truth. This is implied in the first 4 truth claims. For if no such obligation existed, then I could acknowledge that the relativist is correct, but go on making what they say are arrogant, exclusive, and biased truth claims. The relativists would not tolerate this, meaning that they believe I have a moral obligation. So does the objector live like morality is relative? Absolutely not. Imagine a white, middle-aged male, fundamentalist Christian who is smug about their religious beliefs, and arrogant too. He lives in a rural setting in a small town that is just as narrow-minded as he is, excluding anyone who falls outside the bounds of their own narrow beliefs. He is not inclusive to anyone with beliefs that he deems as lesser than his own, and in fact uses his so-called Word of God to hit others on the head, judging them for their life choices with no mercy. He is racist, xenophobic, homophobic, and sexist. He thinks blacks are inferior, that all illegals are criminals, that gay people go to hell, and that a woman's role is in the home, taking care of babies, and that's it. On the other hand, he treats those who are like him with extreme favoritism. And to top it off, let's say he drinks beer on the weekend and votes for Trump. Do you think the relativists would tolerate such a person? Would they be inclusive to this person's ideas? Would they view this man's ideas as equal to their own? No, because no relativist believes that there is no moral truth. They have an agenda just like everyone else, and we see this by their actions and by the truth claims they make. So effectively, moral relativism undermines itself. It's like a man sitting on a tree branch and sawing it off. The fact that they make moral truth claims undermines their core belief that no moral truth exists. So, in many ways, relativism is like a Trojan horse. On the outside, it looks very attractive. It is tolerant, inclusive, and loves unconditionally. But on the inside, it is full of absolute moral truth claims that makes it just as exclusive as the ideas it condemns. So even if the existence of moral absolutes was refuted, for one to believe in them and say differently is dishonest. To drive this point home, let's give a few more examples of spot the absolute moral value. This time we will be spotting it in the life of the objector. So imagine a person saying, You should let each person find out what works for them. And then later, you are narrow-minded if you claim that Jesus is the only way to heaven. So this person implies a moral absolute, which is to be open-minded. Don't be narrow-minded. They also imply that we should find what works best for us. The fact that they use the word should implies that there is a moral component. Or how about this? It is intolerant to say that your culture is right and others are wrong. There is no way that you have absolute moral truth. Well, the absolute moral value here is be tolerant. Don't be intolerant. Or how about you were arrogant if you claim to know the truth about heaven, salvation, and the afterlife? So many have used that to oppress others. You should let people make up their own minds. So here we have two moral values. One is be humble, don't be arrogant. The other is don't oppress others. Let them make up their own minds. If these moral values were relative, then there is a chance that those who are arrogant and that those who oppress are not morally wrong for doing so, in which case their statement would be completely meaningless. Or how about this? Christians are anti-science. They believe in the Genesis creation account when life clearly evolved from a common ancestor. The moral absolute is that one must follow the truth where it leads them. That is, they accuse Christians of intentionally ignoring clear evidence for evolution, all to maintain belief in the Genesis creation account. If the moral value is not absolute, and a Christian could say, "So what? I know what science says, but I want to keep my faith," this would never fly. Or what about this? Each person must make up their own morals. You have no right to exclude others who are just as human as you are. Well, the moral absolute is to be exclusive. Don't exclude others who are just as human as you. Or how about this? I think morality is made by our culture. God definitely cannot be the source of our morals because of the cruel things he does in the Old Testament. Well, they imply that to not be cruel is a moral absolute. Otherwise, God might potentially be correct for being cruel in the Old Testament, in which case their statement would be meaningless. I have heard this in conversations. The so-called relativist will say that truth is relative and then proceed to give a litany of accusations against the God of the Old Testament, as if what he does was morally wrong. How about this? Morality varies. I think everyone should be able to do what they want. The absolute moral value is do what pleases yourself. Or how about this? I think people should decide what's right for them. I don't think the Christian God can tell us what to do. In fact, he abused his own son on the cross, punishing him for a crime that he didn't commit. Well, the absolute moral value here is don't abuse your kids. They accuse God of abusing his son. And they also misrepresent the Bible when they say this. But the relevant point here is that this is not an argument for relativism. It presupposes moral absolutes, just like the Christianity that they accuse does. So we know that no one lives like morality is relative, morality is absolute, which raises the question, what is the source of our absolute moral values? Imagine that you're in a room full of people and you all close your eyes and point to what you think is true north. Since most people do not have an inherent sense of direction, we're not geese, we would all point different directions. And when moral truth is left up to each person, we would have no sense of moral direction. For the conclusion I come to might be different from your conclusion. Such morality could not be absolute. So morality can't be left up to individuals or society for that matter. It also rules out evolution, in which each population decides what best preserves themselves. And don't forget the examples I gave earlier where such logic can be used to justify things like genocide, rape, or murder. So these sources are ruled out because they are not absolute. As it is, our moral absolutes must come from an absolute source, like God. This point is defended in more detail in my Source of Absolute Moral Values video series, part 6 of evolution, or most extensively in part 2 of the problem of evil, but I thought it would be good to mention briefly. So in summary, we showed that moral absolutes exist in two ways, evidentially and presuppositionally. We offered evidence for moral absolutes, saying that despite outward appearances, that we actually have the same moral values, but that has some weaknesses, so we tried the presuppositional route. We showed that the objector already shows through their actions that morality is absolute. This was shown by illustrating the consequences of moral relativism and by looking at the moral truth claims that moral relativists often make. Know that there are other truth claims of moral relativism that are not moral in nature, but still bear a burden of proof. For example, the central claim of relativism is that there are no moral absolutes. Coming from this claim necessarily is the idea that current theories that say that there are moral absolutes are incorrect. This is one of the most exclusive claims of relativism. Also, man's ability to discern truth is limited. Relativists often ask the question, if so many have thought that they had the truth and didn't, then how do you know that you are right? Truth claim number 9 is that God does not exist. Therefore, moral relativism is a form of atheism. This is because the idea of God and moral absolutes cannot be separated. This is especially the case with Christianity, where God's unchanging character is said to be the basis for our moral values. So the relativist must deny the existence of God, which is a claim that they are unlikely to be prepared to defend. Most relativists don't even realize that they're making this claim. They are generally tolerant of Christians, saying Christianity works for you, that's your truth, but not for me. But they don't realize that if there is no moral truth, then Christianity is necessarily false on several levels, which of course would make the Christian ridiculous for believing it. Truth claim number 10 is that one cannot separate the belief from the believer. When the relativist says that the only way to be tolerant of others is to accept that their beliefs are not wrong, they imply that there is no way to separate a belief from the believer. Otherwise, we could be tolerant of others without needing relativism. We could treat a belief and a believer separately, or sin separately from the sinner, like what we see in the Bible. Now, these claims, though not moral, add to the exclusiveness of moral relativism, and they will play a greater role in next week's material, so I am introducing them now. But on the topic of the 10th truth claim, Isaiah 61:10 says, I will greatly rejoice in the Lord, my soul shall exult in my God, for he has clothed me with garments of salvation, he has covered me with the robe of righteousness. So here Isaiah speaks of God being tolerant of sinners, provided that his righteousness is given to them. So, sin and the sinner are treated separately. Relativism necessarily denies this. They see this as impossible, which is why the main motivation for saying there are no moral absolutes is tolerance. But implied in this truth claim is the desire to self-identify. Relativism says, you find your truth. I am the source of truth. I rule my own life. So to attack the belief is to attack the believer. But this comes from a desire to self-identify, which we see in Genesis 3 is the root of all sin. It is man's desire to identify himself as opposed to belonging to someone else like God, and that is the root of all sin. So once again, we see that the Bible, written thousands of years ago, speaks to today's issues in a way that indicts man. These two facts should suggest that the Bible is not written by man. And the bottom line, and we will see this more in next week's material, is that the Bible makes moral absolute truth claims like we see in Matthew 22:37. But so does moral relativism and its relativists. So Christianity and moral relativism are distinguished not by the fact that they claim moral absolutes, but by who the object of those absolutes are. So in Christianity, we have a throne in the center of a person's heart, and on that throne sits a cross, which represents Christ. All that is morally good is that way because it honors Christ. Contrast that with relativism, where the one sitting on the throne is self. And all that is morally good is that way because it honors self, or preserves the species or society, or whatever. So the debate around relativism is not one of intellect. At the bottom of it lies a spiritual battle, God versus self, the desires of the spirit versus the desires of the flesh, or as Ken Ham says, man's word versus God's word. And we will see this in more detail next week. So here are a few discussion questions for you to think about. One is, which approach do you prefer for showing that moral absolutes exist, evidential or presuppositional? And if you don't believe that moral absolutes exist, then how come? Note that to defend such a belief, one must address the evidence in this video that states otherwise. Question 2 is, why do you think that moral relativists are often unaware of the truth claims they make? There, there are probably several answers to this, but one of them relates to the material covered in week 1. Moral relativism is one of those beliefs that is deemed neutral ground. It is one of those things that is thought to be the default mode for thinking, and no evidence needs to be provided for it. Because of this, most relativists don't even realize that they are making absolute moral truth claims. Question 3 involves reading Romans 1:18 through 25. The question is, what does the Apostle Paul say we can know about God from his creation? He says that we can know God's invisible attributes and divine nature through what is made. We can couple that with what we learn about God through the moral absolutes he has given to us to reveal his moral character. So we can get God's non-moral attributes through creation and his moral attributes through the moral law written on our hearts. Question 4 is, moral relativism assumes that the human heart can be trusted to make up its own morality. Why does the Bible strictly prohibit this? For example, Proverbs 3:5 through 6 says to trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Or in 28:26, it says that he who trusts in his own heart is a fool. Jeremiah 17:9 says that the human heart is deceitful above all things. And Judges 17:6 describes a nation of Israel who did what was right in their own eyes. And we know from history that this turned out to not be so right after all. So the Bible would say, don't trust your own heart because it's sinful. Our moral judgment is twisted by sin, which makes it highly dangerous to trust one's own judgment in moral matters. This fundamentally contradicts relativism, which assumes that man is morally competent enough to be writing his own moral code. This indictment of man should suggest that the Bible is not written by man, for no person, especially one with a conflict of interest, would write such a thing about himself. So that is everything. I hope this video helped explain what moral relativism is, the Bible's stance on morality, and a couple of arguments against moral relativism with their implications. Thank you for watching.